In other news, a 15-year-old girl bled to death on a London street. She had been on the bus to school in Croydon. She suffered a fatal wound to her neck. Witnesses described a knife as big as a sword. A policeman tried to stem the crimson, but she died there and then. A spokesman for her school said she had been much loved, and I'm sure she was. Every parent's nightmare, and yet the death of children by knives on the streets of London is a commonplace. And so who are we, and what do we care about? In other news, last week a Nazi was honoured with a standing ovation in the Canadian Parliament in front of smiling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the full complement of MPs, government and opposition. 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka, a Ukrainian living in Canada, formerly of the Waffen-SS, was hailed as a hero for fighting Russians in World War II. For those who have forgotten or never learned, or who are in the business of rewriting history to suit the present agenda, it's worth pointing out the Russians were Canada's allies in World War II. They were ours as well, the USA's, of all of us. The Nazis, men like Hunka, were our enemy. Men and boys, women and girls, all bled out in the face of them. The Waffen-SS were the worst of the worst. On Juno Beach in Normandy in 1944, Canadian men and boys fought other soldiers of the Waffen-SS and paid a dreadful price. Per head of population, few nations were as badly hurt in World War II, bled as heavily in defiance of Nazism as Canada. But now her parliament honours a Nazi. Trudeau was on his feet with all the rest, smiling and clapping. Zelensky raised his fist in salute. Later, Trudeau said it was a mistake, for which he bore no responsibility. Apparently, a big boy did it and ran away. Trudeau invited his fellow Canadians to share the shame that was his and those MPs up on their hind legs. He sought to make all Canadians complicit, including descendants of loved ones who bled and died on Juno Beach and elsewhere. An attempt was made to have any account of the event stricken from the record, to pretend it never happened, to memory hole the disgrace. The abhorrence in the Canadian Parliament played out on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement. Surely that collision of dates was only a coincidence. Surely that, and no one's idea of a sick joke. So much for the truth of World War II. In other news, back in Ukraine, 500,000 men and boys are cold in the clay and still the meat grinder turns, wheels and gears cheerfully whirling. More men and boys die every day, made into butchered meat. Ukrainians and Russians alike, the meat grinder does not discriminate. Somewhere too, the cash registers are ringing with the profits. Billions of pounds and dollars flow into Ukraine from taxpayers all over the West. Money not yet earned, further burdening working people with yet more impossible unpayable debt and generations as yet unborn. Military analysts say the world is at a more dangerous point than any in living memory. Nuclear war is invoked like an unquiet ghost. All of this is happening now. The dark is rising. But back here in Britain, while blood flows elsewhere in immeasurable volume, while blood flows from the neck of a schoolgirl on a street in Croydon, back here in Britain, it's the season of witch hunts, a blast from the past, but always a crowd pleaser. Why trouble ourselves with the slaughter of children in the streets of the capital city? Why contemplate wholesale slaughter of men and boys in a war that's making billions for some, when there's other blood in the water, easier blood? And so who are we, and what do we want? What is it that we care about? In other news, uncounted numbers are dead or ill after taking state-sanctioned meds marketed as vaccines. Every day there's more evidence to challenge the advertising slogan about safe and effective, but still the jabbing continues. In other news, thousands of excess deaths worldwide are recorded every day, which is to say more people are dying than ought to, with no investigation and no explanation of the cause. The death toll of those who might otherwise have been expected to be alive is the equivalent of a fully laden passenger plane crashing in the UK every day. It's statistically accurate to say the United States lost more people in the 18 to 45 age group after a year of the vaccine rollout than that nation saw fall dead in Vietnam in a decade. But you'd have to look hard to find that bald fact in the archives of the mainstream media. In the face of all this dying, is there outrage and peril clutching by the establishment, by the mainstream media, by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown? I think you'll find that as with so much else, so much avoidable death, inexplicable death, ugly, bloody death on the streets of London, the usual suspects are mysteriously, you might say, inexplicably sanguine, which is to say, cold-blooded. In other news, ingredients in the products pushed as vaccines are known to pass to babies via their mother's milk, but no one seems to mind very much about that. Heart attacks harvest callow boys on the field of play. Otherwise healthy people die in their sleep. There's disrupted menstruation for half of all women that took the jabs, sampled by one Norwegian study. Think of that for every other mother, sister, daughter. Is there round-the-clock, wall-to-wall outrage about any of that? Are there furious calls for sackings and resignations, for heads to roll, for any of the companies involved to be shut down, or at the very least to have their activities and individuals suspended, subject to investigations? Not that I'm aware of, but correct me if I'm wrong. In other news, the clock is ticking down to the acceptance by default of amendments to the international health regulations curated by the World Health Organization, the same WHO that has software salesman Bill Gates as its biggest funder and therefore its most potent influencer. To its unelected, unaccountable representatives will pass all manner of power and decision-making that has hitherto been in the hands of national governments, and therefore our hands. Those faceless, nameless characters will have it in their unquestioned power to define vaccine products, to define emergencies, to commandeer national spending on solutions deemed necessary. Come December of this year, the situation of before will be utterly changed, unless our leaders act to the contrary. If you've seen any sign of that action by our elected representatives, do let me know. In other news, we're encouraged to fear, or at least to contemplate once more, the threat of nuclear war. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, told an audience in New York that Russia threatens to use nuclear weapons once again. It's heinous, she said. It is dangerous, and in the shadow of Hiroshima, it is unforgivable. Surely she wasn't hoping her listeners would infer from her ambiguous words it was Russia that dropped atomic bombs on 2 cities in Japan. Surely not. In other news, also dangled tantalisingly before us is the threat, at least the rumour, of an energy crisis. Millions of people are wondering if they'll be able to keep their children warm this winter. In other news, there's talk too of an apocalyptic financial crisis born of the Ponzi scheme that is modern money, and therefore the prospect to be sold to us as solutions of central bank digital currencies and digital IDs that will trap entire populations in cages made not of barbed wire but of technology. In other news, millions of people are on the move, millions of people out of Ukraine and millions from scores of countries besides flowing into Europe and North America from places those people no longer want to be for whatever reason. Who are we, I ask again, and what is it that we care about? Do we pay attention to a world allegedly on the brink of nuclear apocalypse, a world in which wars must be forever to further line the pockets of those already rich beyond the dreams of avarice? Do we pay attention to what's really going on all around us all the time? Or would we rather just watch the mob, the mainstream media mob, the online media mob, doing what the mob does, which is baying always for the next sacrifice, the next throat to be opened, the next witch to be burned? I say events are playing out as they are because the world is in the hands of people who care about nothing and no one except profit and the all-controlling power that unlimited profit affords. Don't be fooled into thinking it's about this ideology or that. Ideology is for the birds, yet more distraction for the well-meaning proles. Nazism, fascism, socialism, communism, free market capitalism, it makes no difference. Those in control and making the decisions care not a jot for ideology, or only inasmuch as it might get them what they want, which is to say, more of everything. They care as much for the stuff of the natural world as they care for you and me, which is not at all. But surely we must stop and ask questions when the history of Nazism might be being rewritten before our eyes. Is this what happens while we're distracted? Surely it's time to tune out the interference and watch the bigger picture. Is this an attempt to have younger generations think those Nazis weren't the enemy after all? Have we even forgotten what Nazis are? In Canada, during the Truckers' Rebellion, the popular movement that already feels like a half-remembered dream, those men and women were labelled Nazis by Trudeau. It was claimed the honk-honk of their horns was code for Heil Hitler. They were imprisoned, had their funds stolen, lost everything. But fast forward, and a real-life Nazi who fought to further the ambitions of Adolf Hitler is honoured as a hero of freedom. Mention world government and you're labelled anti-Semitic. But the so-called Liberal government of Canada hosts a Nazi. the ultimate anti-Semites. And what are the consequences? Have the so-called leaders of the West raised the alarm? Have they condemned what happened in that place on that day? Has Trudeau resigned, or any of his fellow parliamentarians humbled by shame? I don't think any of that's happened, and I don't think it will. Here's the thing. We're at a fork in the road from which there's no turning back. We must open our eyes to the much, much bigger picture, see what's really going on. I ask again, who are we, and what is it that we truly care about? That's just my opinion, of course. You can disagree, and please tweet and email throughout the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk, and you can tweet as well at gbnews, and I'll try to get to your comments later in the show. My guest